Sarah's breath formed ghostly clouds in the bitter November air as she clutched the crumpled newspaper clipping to her chest. The headline that had brought her to Cedar Falls, Montana, "Seasonal Employment Opportunities Available," now felt like a cruel joke. 3 weeks of walking these wind-swept streets, 3 weeks of watching doors close the moment shopkeepers noticed her patched dress and hollow cheeks. The morning had started with such hope. She'd stood outside Morrison's general store at dawn, rehearsing her words, smoothing her worn skirt, and praying that today would be different. But Mrs. Morrison's response had been achingly familiar. "I'm sorry, miss," the woman had said, her voice pitched with the strain of someone telling a necessary lie. "The position has been filled." But Sarah had seen the help wanted sign still hanging in the window as she walked away, and she understood. A woman with no references, no permanent address, and desperation written in every line of her face was not the kind of employee respectable establishments wanted to hire. She'd tried the bakery next, then the seamstress shop, then the small hotel on Main Street. Each rejection felt like another door slamming shut on her future. The irony cut deep. She'd once managed Judge Harrison's household in St. Louis, overseeing 12 staff members and maintaining schedules that would challenge a military commander. Governors and senators had dined at tables she'd set, praising the efficiency of the household she'd run with clockwork precision. But that was before the scandal, before Thomas Harrison's gambling debts destroyed the family's reputation and left their loyal servants without employment or prospects. The judge's fall from grace had been swift and merciless. Creditors had seized the mansion, the fine furnishings. Even the silver Sarah had polished to gleaming perfection every week for 7 years. The staff had been dismissed with barely a day's notice, their years of faithful service reduced to hastily written letters of recommendation that seemed to carry less weight than the paper they were written on. Sarah had tried to find work in St. Louis, but the scandal had spread through society like wildfire. No respectable family wanted to hire someone associated with the Harrison disgrace, no matter how sterling her previous service. Her savings, modest but carefully accumulated over years of faithful employment, had dwindled to nothing as she paid for lodging and searched fruitlessly for work. When the last of her money ran out, she'd made the desperate decision to head west, where her past might not follow her and opportunities might exist for someone willing to work hard. The train ticket to Montana had cost nearly everything she had left, and she'd arrived in Cedar Falls with less than $5 to her name, and the naive belief that a clean conscience and strong work ethic would be enough to secure employment. Now she stood at the edge of town where the train tracks cut through the prairie like a scar, watching snow begin to fall in earnest. Her last coins had bought a single meal 2 days ago, a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread that she'd stretched across 2 days by eating only tiny portions at a time. Tonight, she would have to find shelter somewhere, somehow, or risk freezing to death in the coming storm. The wind picked up, cutting through her threadbare coat like a blade and sending her shawl whipping around her shoulders. She pulled it tighter, but there was no real warmth to be found in the worn wool. Her stomach cramped with familiar hunger, a sensation that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. That's when she noticed the man beside the weather-beaten wagon. 5 children clustered around him like chicks seeking warmth, their faces bearing the telltale signs of meals missed and worries carried too young. The oldest, a boy who looked to be about 12, stood with shoulders squared, as if preparing to defend his family from any threat. A girl, perhaps 10 years old, held the hand of a smaller boy while keeping watchful eyes on an even younger girl who clutched a much-mended doll. The youngest, barely more than a toddler, clung to the man's leg with the desperate grip of someone who understood that this person represented safety in an uncertain world. The man himself was broad-shouldered and solid, with the kind of build that spoke of years spent in physical labor. His hat was weather-beaten but well cared for, his coat patched but clean. There was something in his posture, a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue, that spoke of burdens too heavy for one person to carry alone. When he removed his hat to run a hand through dark hair streaked with premature gray, Sarah could see the lines around his eyes, carved by grief and responsibility. "I understand your hesitation, Mr. Bradley," he was saying to the town's employment broker, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone choosing words carefully. "But I'm not asking for charity. I need help, and I'm willing to pay fair wages for it." Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the children and then back at the man. His expression held the particular discomfort of someone who wanted to help but felt constrained by social conventions. "It's not about the money, Jake. Lord knows you're good for it. It's about finding someone suitable. A single man with 5 young ones. Well, it raises questions. People talk, and any woman willing to work in such circumstances." He trailed off, his meaning clear. Sarah found herself drawing closer, recognition stirring in her chest. She knew the particular rhythm of this conversation, had heard it echo through every rejection of the past weeks. There was something in the man's voice, a quality of quiet desperation that mirrored her own, that made her heart clench with understanding. The man, Jake, straightened to his full, considerable height, and Sarah could see the way his jaw tightened with controlled emotion. "My wife died giving birth to our youngest 8 months ago," he said, each word falling like stones into still water. "I've been managing alone, but winter's coming hard, and I can't leave the children while I tend the cattle. I need someone who can cook, clean, and mind them during the day. It's honest work for honest pay. I understand that, Jake. I truly do. But finding someone willing to take on such responsibility, someone respectable enough to quiet the gossips, I'll take the position." The words left Sarah's lips before she could stop them, carried on a surge of desperation and something that felt remarkably like hope. 3 pairs of adult eyes fixed on her with varying degrees of surprise, and the children turned to study this stranger who'd materialized from the gathering storm like something from a fairy tale. Tom Bradley's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, his expression shifting from surprise to obvious doubt. "Miss, I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't a position for just anyone. I understand perfectly," Sarah said, stepping forward with more confidence than she felt. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady. The man named Jake was studying her with storm-gray eyes, taking in her worn clothing and thin frame, with an expression she couldn't read. There was intelligence in his gaze and something else. A wariness born of too many disappointments, perhaps, but also a flicker of something that might have been hope. "Mister?" she prompted, meeting his gaze directly. "Dalton. Jake Dalton." His voice was cautious but not unkind. "Mr. Dalton needs household help. I need employment. It seems straightforward to me." She tilted her chin up slightly, willing herself not to flinch under his scrutiny. There was something in his weathered face that spoke of loss and hard-won wisdom, lines carved by grief and responsibility that made him seem older than his years. "But you don't know the particulars," Bradley sputtered, clearly flustered by this unexpected development. "The salary, the living arrangements, the expectations. Then perhaps Mr. Dalton could enlighten me." Sarah never took her eyes off the rancher, sensing somehow that this moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sign of weakness or uncertainty, and the opportunity would slip away like all the others. One of the children, the girl of perhaps 10 with dark braids and her father's serious eyes, tugged on Jake's coat sleeve. "Papa," she whispered, loud enough for Sarah to hear, "she looks hungry." The observation, delivered with the brutal honesty of childhood, sent heat flooding Sarah's cheeks. She wanted to deny it, to maintain some dignity in this crucial moment, but the truth was written in her hollow cheeks and too thin frame. She was hungry, desperately, achingly hungry, in a way that went beyond mere appetite to something that felt like slow starvation. But instead of the pity or disgust she expected, Jake's expression softened as he looked down at his daughter. When he raised his eyes to Sarah again, something had shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of one desperate soul by another. "The work is hard," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned not to make promises lightly. "Dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, 5 children aged 3 to 12, a house that hasn't seen a woman's touch in months, and winter setting in fast. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. If you're looking for something easy or temporary, you'd best keep walking. $30 a month. Sarah's heart leaped at the figure. More money than she'd seen one place since leaving St. Louis. But more than that, room and board meant shelter, warmth, regular meals. It meant survival and the chance to prove herself worthy of something better. "I'm not looking for easy, Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm looking for honest work and a chance to prove myself. I've managed large households before. I can cook, clean, mend clothing, and I have experience with children. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I don't require elaborate accommodations." Something flickered in Jake's eyes, surprise perhaps at her direct manner and confident assertions. "When would you be able to start?" "Now. Today. If you'll have me." Jake glanced at his children, who had been listening to this exchange with the grave attention of young people who understood more than adults often gave them credit for. The oldest boy stepped forward slightly, and Sarah sensed some silent communication passing between father and son. "Children," Jake said finally, "this is Miss Mitchell. She's going to come home with us and help take care of things around the ranch." The oldest boy moved forward with the careful politeness of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Mitchell. I'm Daniel." He gestured to the others in turn. "That's Emma, Samuel, Rebecca, and little Thomas." Sarah felt something shift in her chest as she looked at these 5 faces, each reflecting some aspect of loss and resilience in equal measure. Emma, the 10-year-old who'd noticed her hunger, had eyes that held too much understanding for her age. Samuel, perhaps 8, stood with his shoulders squared in unconscious mimicry of his older brother's protective stance. Rebecca, who couldn't be more than 5, clutched her doll with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd learned that beloved things could be lost without warning. And baby Thomas, barely walking, clung to his father's leg with the instinctive knowledge that this man was his anchor in an uncertain world. "It's a pleasure to meet all of you," Sarah said, crouching down to bring herself to their eye level. "I hope we'll become good friends." Rebecca stepped closer, studying Sarah's face with the intense curiosity of childhood. "Are you going to stay?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of carefully contained hope. "The last lady said she would stay, but she left after 2 days. The pain that flickered across Jake's expression was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a surge of something protective and fierce rise in her chest. How many disappointments had these children endured? How many promises had been broken? "I'm going to try very hard to stay," she told Rebecca, reaching out to gently touch the little girl's hand. "But you'll have to help me learn how things work around your house. Can you do that?" Rebecca nodded solemnly, then surprised Sarah by reaching out to touch her cold hand with small, warm fingers. "Your hands are cold," she observed with the matter-of-fact concern of childhood. "Papa's hands get cold when he's been working outside for too long." Jake cleared his throat, his gaze moving between Sarah and his children, with an expression that might have been hope, carefully contained. "We should head back to the ranch," he said. "It's a 2-hour ride, and I want to get the animals settled before this storm gets worse." As they loaded into the wagon, Sarah found herself squeezed between Emma and Samuel on the wooden bench behind Jake, with Rebecca on her lap and baby Thomas secured between his father's knees. The arrangement was cramped but warm, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt the luxury of being surrounded by human presence without the fear of being asked to move along. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels creaking over the frozen ground as they left the town behind. The landscape that opened before them was both beautiful and harsh, rolling prairie stretching to the horizon, broken by stands of trees and the occasional outcropping of rock. The sky was heavy with the promise of snow, gray clouds building with ominous intensity. Emma, sitting beside her, began pointing out landmarks as they traveled. "That's Miller's Creek," she said, indicating a line of trees in the distance. "It runs right through our property. And see those hills? That's where Papa grazes the cattle in summer. They come down closer to the house when it gets cold." Samuel, clearly eager to contribute to the conversation, added his own observations. "We have 47 head of cattle," he said with the precision of someone who'd been helping with the counting, "and 6 horses, but 2 of them are just colts. Papa says maybe next year I'll be big enough to help with the roundup. Sarah listened to their chatter with growing amazement. These children spoke of ranch life with the confidence of young people who'd been raised to understand their place in the working world. They weren't sheltered or pampered, but they also weren't burdened beyond their capacity. There was a sense of family unity here, of shared purpose and mutual responsibility. "What about school?" she asked. "Do you attend classes in town?" Daniel twisted around from his position beside his father. "There's a one-room schoolhouse about 3 miles from our place," he said, "but it's only open when the weather's good and they can find a teacher. Mostly Mama taught us at home." His voice caught slightly on the word Mama, and Sarah saw Jake's shoulders tense at the reminder of their loss. "She was a wonderful teacher," Emma added softly. "She knew all kinds of things, reading and arithmetic and geography. She used to tell us stories about places she'd been before she came west." "What kinds of places?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the woman whose role she was stepping into. "Big cities back east," Samuel said, his eyes wide with the wonder of distant places. "She said there were buildings so tall they seemed to touch the sky, and shops with windows full of beautiful things, and people everywhere wearing fine clothes." Sarah felt a pang of recognition. She knew those cities, had walked those streets when she was young, and her future seemed full of endless possibilities. "Did she ever tell you why she left all of that behind to come west?" The children exchanged glances, and it was Rebecca who answered with the simple honesty of childhood. "She said sometimes you have to leave beautiful things behind to find something even more beautiful. She said our papa was the most beautiful thing she ever found." The statement, so innocent and yet so profound, sent a wave of emotion through Sarah that took her by surprise. She glanced toward Jake's broad back, seeing the slight stiffening of his shoulders that suggested he'd heard his daughter's words. There was a story here, a love story that had brought a refined woman from eastern cities to this harsh frontier land, a romance that had created this close-knit family and then been cut tragically short. As if sensing her thoughts, Emma leaned closer and spoke in a lower voice. "Papa doesn't like to talk about Mama much," she confided. "It makes him too sad, but she was the best mama anyone could have. She made everything seem magical, even ordinary things like baking bread or mending clothes." "I'm sure she was wonderful," Sarah said gently, "and I want you to know that I'm not trying to replace her. No one could do that. I'm just hoping to help take care of things until—" She paused, realizing she didn't know how to finish that sentence. Until what? Until the children were grown? Until Jake found someone else? Until she failed at this job, as she'd apparently failed at everything else? Until you decide you don't want to stay either? Daniel asked, his voice carrying a note of resignation that was heartbreaking in someone so young. Sarah turned to meet his eyes directly, seeing in them the weight of too much responsibility and too many disappointments. "Daniel," she said firmly, "I can't make promises about things I can't control. But I can promise you this. I'm not going to leave just because the work is hard, or because things get difficult, or because I get homesick or scared. If I leave, it will only be because I truly can't do the job you need me to do, and I intend to work very hard to make sure that doesn't happen." The boy studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether her words could be trusted. Finally, he nodded slowly. "That's fair," he said. "I guess that's all anyone can promise." The ranch, when it finally appeared through the gathering dusk, was both better and worse than Sarah had expected. The house itself was substantial, 2 stories of weathered wood with a wide front porch and windows that would let in good light during the day. The barn and outbuildings looked solid and well-maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his property despite his current struggles. But even in the fading light, she could see the signs of a household overwhelmed. Laundry hung frozen on lines that hadn't been properly secured. Fence posts leaned at angles that suggested needed repairs. And what had once been a kitchen garden showed the neglect of an entire growing season gone to waste. "I know it's not much to look at right now," Jake said as he helped her down from the wagon, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment as he surveyed his property through her eyes. Maria had a way of making everything seem organized and welcoming, I'm afraid I haven't inherited that particular skill. Sarah looked around the ranch with the practiced eye of someone who'd been managing households for most of her adult life. Beneath the current chaos, she could see the bones of a place that had once been lovingly tended. The house was solidly built and well positioned to take advantage of natural light and prevailing winds. The outbuildings were thoughtfully arranged for efficiency and convenience. This was a place that had been planned by people who understood ranch life and intended to build something lasting. "It's a beautiful property," she said truthfully. "It just needs some attention." Inside, the evidence of 8 months without a woman's touch was even more apparent, but also more encouraging in its way. The main room was spacious and well built, with a large stone fireplace that would provide both warmth and a gathering place for the family. The furniture was clearly handcrafted by skilled hands. A large dining table that could seat 8 comfortably, chairs with curved backs and strong legs, a rocking chair positioned to catch the light from the front windows. But dust covered every surface like a gray shroud. Dishes were stacked haphazardly on the kitchen table, and children's clothing lay scattered across chairs and floor like fallen leaves after a storm. The kitchen, when Sarah peered into it, showed signs of meals hastily prepared and inadequately cleaned up after. Pots sat on the stove with remnants of previous meals crusted to their bottoms, and the sink was piled high with dishes that had clearly been accumulating for days. "I know it looks overwhelming," Jake said, lighting several oil lamps with practiced efficiency. The warm glow revealed both the potential beauty of the space and the full extent of its current disarray. "Maria always said a house wasn't really a home unless it had love in it. But I'm learning that love isn't enough to keep the dishes clean or the floors swept." Emma had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult faces for signs of disappointment or judgment. "Do you really think it can be fixed?" she asked, her voice small. "It's been like this for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it looked like when Mama was here." Sarah knelt down to bring herself to Emma's eye level, taking the girl's hands in her own. "Emma, sweetheart, this is still a beautiful home. It's just buried under the mess of daily living. Give me a few days and I'll show you what a difference some organization and elbow grease can make." "Can I help?" the girl asked eagerly. "I remember some of the things Mama used to do. I could show you where everything goes." "I would love your help," Sarah said warmly. "In fact, I'm going to need all of you to help me understand how this household works best. You've been living here much longer than I have." Jake had been listening to this conversation while helping Thomas out of his coat, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. "The children are hungry," he said, changing the subject with the abruptness of someone uncomfortable with emotional moments. "I usually just heat up whatever's left from the day before, but I'm afraid the pickings are pretty slim tonight." Sarah was already moving toward the kitchen, her trained instincts taking over as she began assessing what they had to work with. "Let me see what we can create," she said, opening cabinets and peering into the cold storage room with the focused attention of a general surveying a battlefield. What she found was both encouraging and challenging. The pantry held a reasonable supply of basic ingredients: flour, salt, preserved vegetables, dried beans, some tinned goods. There was fresh milk from their own cows, eggs from their own chickens, and even some smoked meat hanging in the cold storage. The raw materials for good meals were there. They simply needed someone with the knowledge and energy to transform them into proper food. "Daniel, could you help me carry some water from the well?" she asked, rolling up her sleeves with businesslike efficiency. "Emma, would you mind gathering up those dishes so I can see what we're working with? Samuel, I'm going to need some kindling for the stove if we're going to get a proper fire going." What followed was a kind of organized chaos that the Dalton household hadn't seen in months. Sarah moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of long practice, her hands seeming to know instinctively where things should be and what needed to be done next. She found flour and managed to get biscuits started, discovered some preserved vegetables that could be turned into a hearty soup, and even located a jar of honey that would make everything seem more special. The children, perhaps sensing that something significant was happening, threw themselves into the effort, with an enthusiasm that spoke of long months of making do with inadequate meals and haphazard household management. Daniel hauled water and split kindling without being asked, his movements efficient and practiced. Emma sorted dishes and cleared surfaces with the competence of someone who'd been doing adult work for far too long, but also with obvious pleasure at seeing order emerge from chaos. Even young Samuel found ways to contribute, gathering scattered utensils and wiping down surfaces with a methodical attention to detail that seemed to be a family trait. Rebecca helped by entertaining baby Thomas, keeping him occupied and out of the way while the older children worked, and occasionally offering suggestions about where things belonged or how Mama used to do particular tasks. Jake, for his part, seemed uncertain how to navigate this sudden transformation of his household. He hovered at the edges of the activity, clearly wanting to help but unsure of his place in this new dynamic. Sarah, recognizing his discomfort, began assigning him small tasks that allowed him to be part of the process without feeling useless. Checking on the biscuits, stirring the soup, setting the table with proper attention to placement and presentation. "You don't have to do all this tonight," he said at one point, when Sarah paused to wipe her hands on a clean towel she'd found buried in a drawer. "You must be tired from traveling, and there'll be plenty of time to get organized tomorrow." Sarah looked around the kitchen, which was already beginning to show signs of order and efficiency, then at the children, who were working together with a harmony that spoke of deep familial bonds despite their current circumstances. "I think we're almost finished," she said, "and besides, there's something to be said for starting as you mean to go on." When they finally sat down to eat, the transformation was remarkable. The table was properly set for the first time in months, complete with napkins and serving dishes that had been gathering dust in forgotten cabinets. The food was hot and plentiful, golden biscuits that were actually light and fluffy, soup rich with vegetables and seasoned with herbs Sarah had found growing wild in what remained of the kitchen garden, and coffee that didn't taste like it had been sitting on the stove for 3 days. The lamplight cast a warm glow over faces that looked more relaxed than they had all day, and Sarah found herself seated between Rebecca and Samuel, with Jake at the head of the table and the other children filling in the remaining spots. It felt like a family dinner, the first real family dinner this house had seen in far too long. "Would you like to say grace, Daniel?" Jake asked, and Sarah realized this was probably a family tradition that had been maintained even through their recent struggles. Daniel bowed his head, and the others followed suit. "Dear Lord," he began, his young voice carrying a gravity that would have been touching in any circumstances, "thank you for bringing Miss Mitchell to help us, and for this good food, and for keeping us all safe. Please watch over Mama in heaven and help us to be good children. Amen." The amens that echoed around the table carried different weights and meanings, but Sarah felt included in their circle in a way that surprised her with its intensity. When she raised her head, she found Jake looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. Gratitude, certainly, but something else as well, something that looked almost like hope. The conversation during dinner was tentative but warm, with the children gradually opening up as they realized Sarah was genuinely interested in their lives and experiences. Samuel told her about the horse he was learning to ride, his face lighting up with enthusiasm as he described the animal's personality and quirks. Emma shared her concerns about the upcoming winter and whether her dresses would last until spring, her practical nature already evident at 10 years old. Rebecca insisted on introducing Sarah to her doll in great detail, explaining the elaborate backstory she'd created for the toy and the various adventures they'd shared together. Even baby Thomas, who had been shy and clingy earlier, began to warm up to Sarah's presence, allowing her to help him with his food and laughing when she made funny faces to encourage him to eat his vegetables. Jake, meanwhile, provided a steady commentary on ranch life and the practical aspects of Sarah's new position. He explained the daily routine, when the children needed to be awakened for their chores, what work was expected of each family member, when meals should be ready to accommodate his schedule in the fields and with the livestock. But beneath the practical information, Sarah sensed he was also taking her measure, trying to determine whether she was truly prepared for the challenges ahead. His questions were casual but probing. Had she ever lived in such an isolated location? Was she comfortable with the idea of being snowed in for extended periods? Did she understand that the nearest doctor was hours away and that emergencies would have to be handled with whatever resources they had on hand? "Winter comes hard out here," he said at one point, his voice serious as he looked out the window at the snow that was beginning to fall more heavily. "We can be cut off from town for days or even weeks at a time, depending on how the storms hit. The nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, and even they might not be able to help if the weather turns really bad. It's not like town living, where you can run to the store if you need something or call on friends when you're feeling isolated. Are you prepared for that kind of solitude?" Sarah considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would carry weight beyond mere conversation. She thought about the months she'd spent in St. Louis after the Harrison scandal, surrounded by people but utterly alone, walking crowded streets where no one knew her name or cared whether she lived or died. "I've been more alone in the middle of a big city than I ever was in the countryside," she said finally. "True isolation isn't about geography, Mr. Dalton. It's about not having people who care whether you live or die, not having a purpose that makes your days meaningful. I think I'd rather be snowed in with 5 children who need me than walking the streets of a city where no one knows my name." The honesty of her response seemed to surprise him, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression, a softening, perhaps, or simply a recognition of shared experience. "The children have been through a lot," he said quietly, glancing around the table to make sure they were absorbed in their own conversations. "They don't trust easily anymore, and they've learned to be careful about getting too attached to people who might leave. I hope you'll be patient with them as they learn to accept your help." "And with you?" Sarah asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Jake's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment the only sound was the children's chatter and the crackling of the fire in the main room. Then a slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him all day. "I reckon I could use some patience too," he admitted. After dinner, the evening routine unfolded with a naturalness that surprised Sarah. The children helped clear the table without being asked, Daniel and Emma working together to wash and dry dishes, while Samuel entertained the younger ones with the simple game that involved counting and sorting dried beans. Jake disappeared briefly to check on the animals, returning with an armload of firewood and the news that snow was beginning to accumulate quickly. "Looks like winter's announcing itself," he said, stomping the snow off his boots before entering the house. "Good thing we got you settled when we did, Miss Mitchell. Might have been a different story if you'd had to wait another week." Sarah, who was helping Rebecca into her nightgown, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The randomness of her good fortune wasn't lost on her. A few more days of rejections, and she might have been forced to move on to the next town, or worse. The thought of what might have happened if she hadn't encountered Jake Dalton today was too frightening to contemplate. "Papa?" Emma said, emerging from the kitchen with the last of the clean dishes. "Where is Miss Mitchell going to sleep?" The question hung in the air with surprising weight, and Sarah realized that in all the practical discussions of the day, this detail had somehow been overlooked. Jake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign of uncertainty. "I hadn't. That is, I suppose we should have discussed the arrangements beforehand," he said. "There's a small room off the kitchen that Maria used for sewing and mending. It's not large, but it has a window, and we could move a bed in there. Would that be suitable?" "That sounds perfect," Sarah said quickly, relief flooding through her. She'd been prepared to sleep in the barn if necessary, so any space within the warm house felt like luxury. "I'll help you move the furniture," Daniel offered, and within an hour the small room had been transformed into modest but comfortable quarters. Jake produced clean bedding from a cedar chest that smelled of lavender and mothballs, and Emma contributed a small rag rug that would make the floor less cold on winter mornings. Rebecca insisted on picking wildflowers from her mother's dried arrangements to place on the single window sill, and even baby Thomas helped by carrying in a pillow that was almost as large as he was. Standing in the doorway of her new room, surrounded by the Dalton family as they fussed over making her comfortable, Sarah felt something inside her chest that she'd almost forgotten existed. It was the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than herself, of having people who cared about her comfort and well-being, not because they were paid to, but because they genuinely wanted her to be happy. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching slightly on the words. "All of you. This is more than I had hoped for." Jake stepped forward, his head in his hands, in a gesture that was both formal and somehow intimate. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I want you to know that what you did today, taking on a job without knowing anything about us, helping with dinner, making the children smile for the first time in weeks, well, it means more than I can properly express. I hope you'll be happy here." Sarah met his eyes, seeing in them a vulnerability that matched her own. "I think I will be, Mr. Dalton." As the family dispersed to their respective bedrooms, Sarah found herself alone for the first time all day. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of a household settling down for the night, footsteps on the stairs, quiet voices saying good night, the creak of floorboards and the whisper of wind around the windows. Outside, snow was falling steadily, covering the world in a blanket of white that would have seemed ominous just hours earlier. Now, from inside the warm house with the promise of steady work and people who needed her, the snow seemed like a blessing, nature's way of sealing her into this new life and making it impossible to reconsider her decision. She unpacked her few possessions, hanging her spare dress on a peg Jake had installed, and arranging her toiletries on the small washstand he'd provided. Everything she owned fit easily into the space, leaving room for the possibility of accumulating more belongings in the future, a luxury she hadn't dared consider in months. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought her to this place. 3 weeks of rejection and desperation had led to a single moment of courage, a decision to speak up when she might have remained silent. And that moment had transformed not just her circumstances, but perhaps her entire future. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jake moving around in the main room, banking the fire and checking the doors. The sounds were domestic and reassuring, the actions of a man who took his responsibility seriously and cared deeply about protecting those under his roof. There was something profoundly comforting about knowing she was part of that protection now, part of the circle of people he was determined to keep safe. When all the sounds finally faded and the house settled into true quiet, Sarah lay in her narrow bed and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival that had sustained her through weeks of hunger and rejection, but something deeper and more substantial. Hope for the future, hope for connection, hope for the possibility that she might not just survive, but actually build something meaningful with these people who had taken her in. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Sarah drifted off to sleep with the sound of wind in the eaves and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new chances to become part of something that felt remarkably like home. The first real test of Sarah's resolve came at dawn 3 days later, when baby Thomas woke crying and the sound echoed through the thin walls of the house like a clarion call of distress. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn darkness, pinning her hair back with practiced efficiency and wrapping her shawl around her shoulders before venturing into the main room. Jake was already there, bouncing Thomas on his hip while trying to coax the fire back to life with his free hand. He looked up when Sarah appeared, his hair disheveled and his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry he woke you," Jake said, his voice hoarse with sleep and exhaustion. "He's been having trouble sleeping through the night since Maria died. I usually just walk with him until he settles down again, but it can take hours sometimes." Sarah held out her arms without hesitation. "May I?" Jake transferred the baby with obvious relief, and Sarah was struck by how natural it felt to cradle the warm, solid weight of a child against her chest. Thomas had stopped crying the moment she picked him up, and now he regarded her with curious, dark eyes that were exactly like his father's. "Hello, little one," she murmured, swaying gently to side in the age-old rhythm of mothers comforting children. "What's troubling you this morning? Are you hungry, cold, or just lonely?" As if in response to her question, Thomas reached up and grabbed a strand of her hair, examining it with the intense focus that only very young children could manage. Sarah laughed softly, gently extricating her hair from his grasp and settling into the rocking chair that sat near the fireplace. "He likes you," Jake observed, coaxing the fire into a proper blaze before turning his attention back to them. "He's usually shy with strangers, but he seems comfortable with you." "Children often sense when someone genuinely wants to help," Sarah said, continuing her gentle rocking motion. "And I suspect Thomas knows he's surrounded by people who love him, which makes it easier for him to trust new faces." Jake settled into the chair across from her, and for a few minutes they sat in comfortable silence, watching Thomas gradually relax into sleep. The early morning light filtering through the windows was soft and golden, casting everything in a warm glow that made the moment feel almost sacred. "Maria used to sit in that chair," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the particular tone people used when sharing memories that were both precious and painful. "She'd rock him for hours sometimes, singing little songs in Spanish that her grandmother had taught her. I never learned the words, but the melodies were beautiful." Sarah looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, understanding suddenly that she was occupying a space that had belonged to someone else, someone deeply loved and profoundly missed. The realization filled her with both humility and determination. She wasn't trying to replace Maria Dalton, but she could honor her memory by caring for the family she'd left behind. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into the work of restoring order to the Dalton household with an energy and determination that surprised even herself. Each morning brought new challenges and small victories as she gradually transformed the chaos of 8 months without proper management into something resembling the well-run home it had once been. The kitchen was her first priority, and she attacked the accumulated grime and disorganization with methodical precision. She scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, organized the pantry according to a system that made meal planning efficient, and established routines for daily cleaning that would prevent the overwhelming buildup of mess. But more than just cleaning, Sarah began to implement the kind of household management she'd perfected during her years with Judge Harrison. She created schedules that ensured every necessary task was completed without overwhelming any single person. She established systems for everything from laundry to meal preparation to the children's education, bringing order and predictability to lives that had been marked by uncertainty for too long. The children responded to this new structure with enthusiasm that spoke of how desperately they'd needed it. Emma, relieved of the overwhelming responsibility of trying to manage household tasks beyond her years, began to flourish in ways that revealed her natural intelligence and creativity. She showed Sarah the location of her mother's recipe collection and eagerly learned more advanced cooking techniques, taking pride in creating meals that brought obvious pleasure to her family. Daniel, no longer forced to carry the emotional and practical burden of being the family's primary support system, began to relax and act more like the 12-year-old boy he actually was. He still took his responsibilities seriously, but now those responsibilities were age-appropriate and shared with a competent adult who could provide guidance and support. Samuel, freed from the anxiety of an unpredictable household, threw himself into learning with an enthusiasm that delighted Sarah. She discovered that he had a quick mind and genuine curiosity about the world beyond their ranch, and she began to supplement his basic lessons with stories and information that fed his hunger for knowledge. Even little Rebecca seemed to blossom under the security of knowing that meals would appear regularly, that clean clothes would be available when needed, and that there was always an adult available to answer questions, provide comfort, or simply listen to her elaborate stories about her doll's adventures. Jake, meanwhile, watched these transformations with an expression of growing wonder and gratitude. The lines of stress and exhaustion that had marked his face began to fade as he realized he no longer had to worry constantly about whether his children were being properly cared for in his absence. For the first time in months, he could focus on the ranch work that was his expertise and passion, secure in the knowledge that his household was in capable hands. "I don't know how you do it," he said one evening as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. "You make it all look so effortless, but I know how much work it takes to keep everything running smoothly." Sarah looked up from the socks she was darning, smiling at the genuine admiration in his voice. "It's not effortless," she said. "It's just organized. When everyone knows what's expected of them and when, it becomes routine rather than chaos." "Maria used to say something similar," Jake said, his voice soft with memory. She had a way of making even the most complicated tasks seem manageable. I never appreciated how much skill that took until I had to try to do it myself. They had been having more of these conversations lately. Quiet exchanges in the evening hours when the day's work was done and they could simply enjoy each other's company. Sarah found herself looking forward to these moments, treasuring the growing ease between them and the gradual deepening of trust and understanding. The real test of that trust came in early December, when Samuel fell seriously ill with a fever that spiked to dangerous levels and left him delirious and frightening weak. The symptoms appeared suddenly during the morning lessons, and within hours he was burning up and complaining of severe headaches and body aches that made even the slightest movement painful. "It might be the influenza that's been going around town," Jake said, his voice tight with worry as he felt Samuel's forehead. Dr. Morrison mentioned that several families have been dealing with it, and it can be serious in children. Sarah had been through childhood illnesses before, but never in such an isolated location with so much responsibility resting on her shoulders. The nearest doctor was a 2-hour ride away in good weather, and with snow beginning to fall again, that journey would be difficult and potentially dangerous for both the person making the trip and the patient left behind. "What do you think we should do?" Jake asked, and Sarah realized he was looking to her for guidance, not just as the hired help, but as someone whose judgment he had come to trust implicitly. "Let's see how he responds to basic care before we decide whether to risk the trip to town," she said, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I have some experience nursing children through fevers, and if it is influenza, there's not much a doctor can do that we can't manage here with careful attention and good nursing." What followed were 3 of the most challenging days Sarah had experienced since arriving at the ranch. Samuel's fever spiked and broke repeatedly, leaving him delirious one moment and shivering uncontrollably the next. Sarah barely left his side, cooling him with damp cloths when the fever climbed too high and wrapping him in warm blankets when the chills took hold. She monitored his breathing, encouraged him to take small sips of water when he was conscious enough to swallow, and watched for any signs that his condition might be deteriorating beyond what they could handle. Most frightening were the periods when the fever rose so high that Samuel became confused and agitated, calling for his mother and seeming not to recognize the people around him. The other children, initially excited by the drama of Samuel's illness, quickly became worried and then genuinely frightened as his condition worsened. Rebecca developed a tendency to burst into tears at unpredictable moments. Daniel became uncharacteristically snappish with his siblings, and even baby Thomas seemed to sense the household's anxiety and became fussy and difficult to comfort. Jake, meanwhile, was torn between his responsibilities to the ranch and his desire to help care for his sick son. The cattle still needed to be fed and watered, the other animals required attention, and there were urgent repairs that couldn't be postponed just because of illness. But he spent every moment he could spare hovering anxiously in Samuel's room, his face etched with the particular terror that comes to parents when their children are seriously ill. "You should try to get some rest," Sarah told him on the second night, when she found him slumped in the chair beside Samuel's bed, his eyes red with exhaustion and worry. "I can't," Jake said simply, his voice raw with emotion. "If something happened to him while I was sleeping, if he took a turn for the worse and I wasn't here, I'd never forgive myself." Sarah understood his feelings completely, but she could also see that his exhaustion was making him less effective as both a father and a rancher. "What if we take turns?" she suggested. "You rest for a few hours while I stay with him, and then I'll rest while you take over. That way someone is always watching, but we both get the sleep we need to think clearly and make good decisions." The arrangement worked better than either of them had hoped. Jake was able to catch up on the most critical ranch work during his rest periods, while Sarah's training in household management had included enough basic nursing knowledge to monitor Samuel's condition and provide appropriate care. More importantly, the crisis brought out qualities in both of them that might have remained hidden under normal circumstances. Jake revealed himself to be a tender and intuitive caregiver, able to comfort his son with quiet words and gentle touches that seemed to reach Samuel even in his most delirious moments. Sarah discovered that she possessed reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known existed, finding herself capable of functioning effectively even when running on minimal sleep and maximum stress. The turning point came on the third night, when Samuel's fever finally broke completely, and he woke up asking for water in a voice that sounded like himself again. Sarah, who had been dozing in the bedside chair, was instantly alert and reaching for the pitcher she'd kept at hand throughout his illness. "Miss Mitchell?" Samuel said weakly as she helped him sit up to drink. "Did I miss very many lessons?" The question, so perfectly characteristic of his earnest nature, made Sarah laugh with relief, even as tears sprang to her eyes. "Don't worry about lessons right now," she said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "There will be plenty of time for learning when you're feeling stronger." Jake appeared in the doorway at that moment, drawn by the sound of voices, and his face transformed when he saw Samuel sitting up and alert. "How are you feeling, son?" he asked, moving quickly to the bedside. "Better," Samuel said, though his voice was still weak. "Hungry, I think, and tired, but not the sick kind of tired." Sarah felt a weight lift from her chest that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The crisis was over, and they had navigated it successfully as a team. More than that, they had proven to themselves and each other that they could handle serious challenges together. Winter settled over the ranch in earnest after Samuel's recovery, bringing snow that piled high against the windows and temperatures that made venturing outside a matter of necessity rather than pleasure. But inside the house, life had taken on a rhythm that felt both cozy and productive. The children's education continued with increasing sophistication as Sarah discovered textbooks that had belonged to their mother and began implementing more structured lessons. She found that Maria Dalton had been an educated woman with excellent taste in educational materials, and the books she'd accumulated provided a solid foundation for teaching everything from basic arithmetic to geography and natural science. Daniel proved to have a quick mind for mathematics and a genuine interest in the business aspects of ranch management. Sarah began including him in discussions about household budgets and planning, recognizing that he would likely take on increasing responsibility as he grew older, and that practical knowledge would serve him well. Emma showed talent for both domestic arts and bookkeeping, skills that would serve her well whether she remained on the ranch or eventually sought opportunities elsewhere. Samuel's recovery from his illness seemed to have unlocked new intellectual curiosity, and he approached every lesson with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. His questions were thoughtful and often surprisingly sophisticated, revealing a mind that was eager to understand not just facts but the connections between different ideas and concepts. Even little Rebecca, at 5, was ready for more formal learning, and she took to her letters and numbers with the same determination she brought to everything else. Baby Thomas, meanwhile, was beginning to say recognizable words and take his first uncertain steps, reaching every milestone with the confidence of a child who knew he was surrounded by people who celebrated his achievements. The isolation that Jake had warned Sarah about proved to be less of a hardship than either of them had anticipated. The family had developed such a rich internal life, with reading sessions, informal lessons, collaborative projects, and simple conversations, that the outside world seemed less necessary than it might have otherwise. But the isolation also created an intimacy that might not have developed under different circumstances. The result was a deepening of relationships and a growing sense that they were creating something special together, not just a functional household, but a genuine family unit. This sense of family solidarity was tested when the first real blizzard of the season struck in late December, cutting them off from the outside world for nearly a week. The storm came up suddenly, trapping Jake in the barn when he'd gone out for evening chores and leaving Sarah to manage 5 worried children through a night of howling wind and driving snow. "Where's Papa?" Rebecca asked, for what felt like the 100th time, pressing her face against the window that showed nothing but white darkness. "He's safe in the barn," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "Remember what he told us. If the weather gets bad when he's doing chores, he'll stay there until it's safe to come back to the house." But as the night wore on and the storm showed no signs of abating, Sarah found herself struggling with genuine fear. What if Jake was hurt? What if something had happened to the animals? What if the storm lasted so long that their food supplies ran out? Daniel, reading her expression with the perceptiveness that seemed to run in the family, moved closer to her on the sofa, where they'd all gathered to wait out the storm. "Papa knows how to take care of himself," he said quietly, speaking low enough that the younger children couldn't hear. "He's been through storms like this before, and we know how to take care of ourselves too, if we need to." The simple faith in his voice, combined with the maturity of his assessment, reminded Sarah that she wasn't facing this crisis alone. These children had already proven their resilience and capability, and together they could handle whatever the storm might bring. She was right to have faith in them. Over the next 3 days, as the storm raged outside and Jake remained trapped in the barn, the family pulled together with remarkable cooperation. The older children took on additional responsibilities without being asked. Rebecca controlled her anxiety by helping with simple tasks that made her feel useful, and even baby Thomas seemed to sense the need for good behavior. Sarah rationed their food supplies carefully, planned activities that would keep everyone occupied and positive, and maintained routines that provided structure and normalcy in abnormal circumstances. Most importantly, she projected calm confidence even when she was feeling anything but calm herself. When Jake finally appeared at the kitchen door on the 4th morning, stamping snow off his boots and looking exhausted but unharmed, the relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense, it left her weak-kneed. "Papa!" Rebecca shrieked, launching herself into his arms with such force that he staggered backward. The reunion that followed was joyful and emotional, with everyone talking at once and competing to tell Jake about how they'd managed during his absence. But Sarah noticed that his first concern, after assuring himself that everyone was healthy and safe, was to seek her out with his eyes and mouth a silent thank you that carried the weight of profound gratitude. Later, when the children were napping and they had a moment of relative privacy, Jake found Sarah in the kitchen where she was taking inventory of their remaining food supplies. "I can't tell you how grateful I am," he said without preamble. "When that storm hit and I realized I was trapped out there with no way to get back to the house, all I could think about was what you do with 5 frightened children and no idea when I'd return." Sarah looked up from her list, meeting his eyes directly. "I did exactly what any mother would do," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. "I took care of them." The word mother seemed to echo in the space between them, and Sarah realized she'd spoken more truth than she'd intended. Over the past months, she had indeed been functioning as a mother to these children, not replacing their beloved Maria, but filling the maternal role their daily lives required. Jake's expression grew soft and wondering. "Yes," he said quietly, "you did." The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd shared before. Sitting at the kitchen table with cups of coffee growing cold between them, they talked about the children's needs, their own growing feelings, and the possibility of formalizing the relationship that had developed so naturally between them. "I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of the situation," Jake said, his voice careful and respectful. "What's grown between us, it feels real and lasting to me. But I want to be sure you feel the same way. You came here looking for work, not a husband and 5 children." Sarah considered his words, thinking about the woman who'd stood outside Morrison's general store just a few months ago, desperate and alone. That woman had indeed been looking for nothing more than employment and survival. But the woman she'd become in this house with these people wanted so much more. "Jake," she said, using his first name deliberately for the first time. "I came here looking for a job, but I found a family. What's grown between us feels like the most real thing I've ever experienced. If you're asking whether I'd be willing to make this arrangement permanent, not just as your employee, but as your wife and the children's mother, then yes, that's exactly what I want." The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative, but it carried the promise of deeper intimacy to come. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling with the particular joy that comes when 2 people discover they want the same future. The children, when they were told the news the next morning, reacted with varying degrees of surprise and delight. Rebecca clapped her hands and immediately began planning what she would wear to the wedding. Samuel wanted to know if this meant Sarah would never leave them, and when assured that this was exactly what it meant, he smiled with such satisfaction that it was clear he'd been worrying about this possibility for weeks. Emma's reaction was more complex, and Sarah made sure to spend private time with her to address any concerns about another woman trying to replace her beloved mother. "I would never try to take your mama's place," Sarah said as they sat together in the sewing room that had become her sanctuary. "She was your first mother, and she'll always hold that special position in your heart. But I hope I can be a second mother to you, someone who loves you just as much, but in a different way." Emma considered this carefully, her serious little face reflecting the weight of the decision she was making. "I think Mama would like you," she said finally. "She always said the most important thing was that we be loved and taken care of, and I think she'd be happy that Papa isn't sad anymore." Daniel's acceptance came in the form of practical questions about how the change would affect the family's routines and responsibilities. Once assured that Sarah would continue to value his contributions and include him in important decisions, he gave his approval with the gravity of someone whose opinion truly mattered. Even baby Thomas seemed to sense the significance of what was happening, reaching for Sarah with increasing frequency and babbling happily whenever she held him. Spring came early that year, bringing not just the literal renewal of the land, but a metaphorical rebirth for the entire family. The wedding took place in April, a simple ceremony in the main room of the ranch house, with the circuit preacher performing the service and the children serving as witnesses. Sarah wore Emma's carefully altered confirmation dress, and Jake wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that Rebecca had insisted on making. But if the ceremony was simple, the emotion behind it was profound. As they exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other, and to create a family built on mutual respect and shared commitment, Sarah felt she was not just marrying Jake, but formally adopting all 5 children as her own. The transformation from employee to wife and mother was surprisingly seamless, perhaps because the emotional bonds had been forming gradually over months of shared experience. What changed was not so much their daily interactions as their understanding of their permanent commitment to each other. Jake, freed from the worry of whether Sarah might decide to leave, became more openly affectionate and demonstrative. He began including her in long-term planning decisions, seeking her opinion on everything from crop rotation to the children's educational goals. Most importantly, he started sharing more of himself, his dreams for the future, his memories of the past, and his daily experiences in ways that made Sarah feel like a true partner rather than just a helpmate. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself settling into the role of ranch wife with surprising ease. The skills she'd developed managing households served her well in her new position, but the emotional satisfaction was unlike anything she'd experienced before. These were her children now, her husband, her home. Every improvement she made and every problem she solved was an investment in her own future rather than just a service performed for others. One evening in late spring, as Sarah sat on the front porch watching Jake teach Rebecca to ride her first pony while the other children cheered encouragement, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than a year ago, she'd been a homeless woman with no prospects and no hope. Now she was the beloved wife and mother of a thriving family, with a home that was truly her own and a future that stretched ahead full of promise. "What are you thinking about?" Jake asked, settling beside her on the porch steps after ensuring Rebecca was safely dismounted and the pony properly cared for. "Just marveling at how much can change in such a short time," Sarah said, leaning into his warmth as the children played in the yard before them. "This time last year, I couldn't have imagined any of this. I thought my life was over, but it was actually just beginning." Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "When Maria died, I thought the best part of my life was behind me. I was just trying to survive each day and keep the children safe. I never imagined I could be this happy again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the golden light of early evening. Daniel was helping Samuel practice roping a fence post, while Emma supervised Rebecca's attempts to braid wildflowers into chains. Baby Thomas toddled between all of them, laughing with delight at their various activities. As sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah Dalton, no longer Sarah Mitchell, knew with absolute certainty that her greatest adventure was just beginning. The woman who had been turned away from every job in town had found something infinitely more valuable than employment. She had found her way home,